Welcome, everyone. My name is John Paul Jones. I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and I welcome all of you here tonight on behalf of my colleagues, Joaquin Ruiz, Dean of the College of Science, Diana Liverman, co-director of the University of Arizona Institute of the Environment, and Tony Massaro, Regents Professor and former Dean of the College of Law. I also represent the Howry Program trustees tonight, Mary Greer, Tammy Barnett, and Greg Gadarian. And a special thanks I want to give to the Senior Program Coordinator for the Howry Program at the University of Arizona, Dr. Anna Spitz. As you can see from the rotating slides, we're here tonight to celebrate the work and generosity of an amazing woman, Agnes Nelms Howry. Those who knew her well, and I was fortunate enough to have met her several times, speak of her intelligence and her wit, her worldly knowledge, and her humility. She was cosmopolitan and progressive, while also being down to earth and frank. We at the University of Arizona have been privileged to have been the recipient of so much of Mrs. Howry's philanthropy over the many years she lived in Tucson. As you saw from the slideshow, her generosity touched many parts of the institution, from anthropology and archaeology to translation and tree ring science. She believed in investing in people for the benefit of the social good. The UA is especially thankful that the trustees of Mrs. Howry's estate have chosen us to carry out her legacy in the name of improving our social and natural environments. Southern Arizona has many challenges at the intersection of environmental and social justice: drought and food insecurity, invasive species and rising temperatures, lack of water, and poverty. Fortunately, we have dozens, indeed hundreds, of faculty and students working on issues of environmental sustainability, climate change, peace and human rights, and social justice across all of the colleges of the university. In just its first year, the program is already supporting faculty and students working on tribal climate adaptation, poverty and vulnerability, the people and cultures of the Southwest, immigration rights, and environmental education. These scholars join with the UA's major initiatives on indigenous law, human rights, climate adaptation and outreach, international development, and civil discourse, to name just a few. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Tracy Osborne, Assistant Professor in the School of Geography and Development in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, who will in turn introduce President Mary Robinson. Dr. Osborne, who received her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, is a fitting person to introduce President Robinson, as she is an engaged scholar who works at the intersection of environment and social justice, and she has a demonstrated commitment to community collaborations. Her interest in climate justice stems from a mission to integrate her personal experiences from her family's home country of Guyana into her scholarship and public engagement. There, indigenous peoples face threats to their livelihood through the destruction of the northern Amazonian rainforest, the attendant loss of biodiversity, and the potential for sea level rise in the country's low-lying areas. Having witnessed these changes firsthand, Dr. Osborne has dedicated her research in Latin America, especially in Mexico, to studying the complex relationships between climate change mitigation in forests and the lives of indigenous peoples for whom those areas have such important social, cultural, economic, and sacred value. She works closely with indigenous organizations to produce concrete responses to the problems of climate change. Her community collaborations are made international through her founding, with her graduate students, of the University of Arizona's Public Political Ecology Lab, or PEOPLE, a virtual clearinghouse for innovative, engaged research that connects scholars from all over the world with concerned publics in the service of environmental and social justice. Dr. Tracy Osborne.
Thank you, Dean Jones, and good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. It is a tremendous privilege and honor to introduce this evening's speaker in launch of the Agnes Nelms-Howry Program in Environment and Social Justice. I have enormous admiration for President Mary Robinson, a woman who has contributed to the world in so many ways. As former President of Ireland, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, member of the esteemed group of elders, professor of law at Trinity College Dublin, and now as head of her foundation for climate justice. In every action, project, and initiative she's undertaken, she's been steady in her unrelenting stand for human rights and social justice, never failing to advocate for the most vulnerable populations. For this work, she's been duly recognized with awards and honors, including the Indira Gandhi and Sydney Peace Prizes, and in 2009, she received the US Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor given in the United States. When she received the Medal of Freedom, US President Barack Obama told a well-known story that continues to inspire me. Throughout her term, President Robinson maintained a tradition of leaving a light on in her window as a reminder to Irish immigrants living abroad that they were loved and remembered by those they had left behind. Just as President Robinson's light was an important beacon for the Irish diaspora, her dedication to human rights and social justice have illuminated a path for so many around the world, including many of us here at the University of Arizona. President Mary Robinson is a true public intellectual, someone who harnesses the power of ideas to change our world. Trained as a lawyer at University of Dublin, King's Inns Dublin, and Harvard Law School, President Robinson used her legal training for a vehicle for social change. For about 2 decades, she dedicated her efforts to intellectual inquiry at Trinity College Law, to political change as a member of the Irish Senate, and to the practice of law, where she won numerous landmark cases for social equity. In 1990, she became the 7th President of Ireland and the first woman elected to that position. Recognizing the transformative potential of her position, President Robinson was an active and remarkably popular leader. She reached out to the Irish diaspora around the world, supported gay rights, gender equality, the right to contraception, and drew attention to suffering in countries such as Rwanda. Following her presidency, she became the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and in 2001 presided over the historic World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. She's continued to work with the United Nations and currently serves as UN Special Envoy for climate change. She is also a member of the Elders, a group of wise and independent world leaders convened by Nelson Mandela in 2007 that includes Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Kofi Annan, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and Jimmy Carter. The Elders have a common commitment to peace and human rights and are a moral compass for us all, providing guidance for tackling the world's greatest challenges. She was the founder and president of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, which was an 8-year project to bring human rights principles into trade and policymaking. And she now heads the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, which is a center for education and advocacy with a bold vision that by the year 2020, principles of justice and equity will guide climate action and a people-centered development. One of the Foundation's 7 principles of climate justice is to harness the transformative power of education for climate stewardship. Education can deepen public awareness of climate change, and when anchored from a base in ethics and justice, can produce knowledge that can transform our world in profound ways. This is the power of public and engaged scholarship. President Mary Robinson is an inspiration for many of us here at the University of Arizona who are motivated by social and environmental justice and committed to engaged scholarship. As an engaged scholar working on issues of climate justice myself, I am personally inspired by the work of President Robinson and her role as a public intellectual. My own interest in climate justice stems from a mission to integrate my personal experience with an intellectual contribution that extends more broadly beyond the halls of academia. As Dean Jones mentioned, my family is from Guyana, a country in the northern Amazon with one of the most intact and biodiverse forests in the Americas. And I've been deeply disturbed by the multiple threats to Guyana's rainforests and the implications for indigenous and forest communities, as well as the high levels of poverty and vulnerability to climate impacts along the country's low-lying coastal region. And I now conduct research in Latin America, exploring the complex relationship between climate change mitigation in forests and indigenous peoples for whom forests have important cultural, socioeconomic, and sacred value. And I've been working closely with indigenous organizations to produce reports and maps that explore questions of climate justice. This is an example of the work of the Public Political Ecology Lab, which I'm excited to have founded with graduate students here at the U of A. The lab is a clearinghouse for innovative and engaged research that connects scholars with the broader public in the service of social, environmental, and climate justice. So this should explain a little bit why I'm so pleased and honored to have this opportunity to introduce President Robinson. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank her for keeping a light on in her window, for shining a light on the linkages between human rights and climate justice, and for providing a guiding light for engaged scholars and all of us who seek a more socially just and environmentally sustainable world. So now, if you'd all please join me in welcoming President Mary Robinson to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to Dr. Tracy Osborne for that very warm introduction and for a very strong indication of her own commitment to issues of human rights, climate change, climate justice. I'm really very pleased to be here in the University of Arizona and to be invited to speak on human rights and climate change, or what I refer to as climate justice. And I very much appreciated receiving a note of welcome from President Anne Weaver Hart, and I'm sorry that we won't be able to meet on this occasion because she can't be here. But I did receive a very warm welcome when I arrived from Diane Lieberman, the co-director of the Institute of the Environment, and also from Anna Spitz of the Howry program on environment and social justice. And this afternoon I had a really good discussion with a number of the faculty and graduate students of this great university who have a particular interest in climate change, human rights, how we can move forward, what are the issues, what are the questions we have to address. And I feel very at home, to be honest, in this university because the whole discussion is so people-centered. It's about people and the development and how we are stewards or not such good stewards of our world. And that really was very good from my point of view. I would like to acknowledge in the audience someone I can't see because it's too dark, but I understand she's there, and that is Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. I admire her greatly. We have met briefly a few times, and it's great that she's here this evening. And I'm also delighted that her supportive spouse, Mark Kelly, is here. A supportive spouse is very important in life, as I know after 45 years of having a very supportive spouse. I think I want to begin with a kind of note of humility in a way when talking about the science and the environmental issues of climate change, because that's not where I began. Now, I did have a very early start on equality and human rights, and that's because growing up in the west of Ireland, and there must be some Irish people at least in the audience, I thought so. Growing up in the west of Ireland, I was wedged between four brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger than me. So of course I had to be interested in equality, human rights, using my elbows, being at least as good as they were. But in fact, I remember I served for 5 years as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I never made any significant speech on climate change. That was between 1997 and 2002. I was aware that there was a process dealing with climate change called the UN Climate Framework, but I didn't really know much about it. It was later, because I decided when I finished my term as High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2002, that there was a need for action on economic and social rights. There were wonderful organizations giving leadership from a civil society point of view on civil and political rights, no torture, rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, etc. Organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and Human Rights First. But there wasn't enough attention to the other important stream of human rights that I had been presiding over and giving leadership on as High Commissioner for Human Rights. Rights to food and safe water and health and education and shelter. So I decided to form a small organization which we called Realizing Rights. I was actually based in New York with some colleagues in Washington, D.C. and in Geneva, but we were working in African countries. Sounds a bit illogical, but it worked. And we were working, I was also honorary president of Oxfam International, and that helped because I could link with Oxfam working on the ground. And we were working on issues of health, right to health in African countries, women, peace and security issues, and corporate responsibility. And that began in 2002. And by about 2003, 2004, I realized I was hearing the same sentence all over the place, which began more or less, but things are so much worse. And I found that the worse was actually to do with weather, climate impacts. It was the fact that the rainy seasons were no longer predictable in Liberia. It was the fact that in northern Uganda, my friend Constance O'Kellett said that when she was growing up in her village, they had enough food because they knew when to sow and they knew when to harvest. But now they had long periods of drought and then flash flooding and then more drought. It was the Horn of Africa, Somalia, which I'd been in as president in 1992, suffering even more drought, and parts of Kenya and the whole Sahel. It was Malawi, a large country where almost at the same time, in one part they had huge flooding and another part drought, destroying harvests. And I realized that this was really having a very severe impact on communities. It was real time, it was happening now, and it was climate change. And for the first time I realized this wasn't something about the future. And then when I read the science and informed myself, I became aware, and I've said this several times, that this is probably the biggest human rights issue that we face in the world today. Probably the biggest human rights issue. And I say that because the effects are already serious, but we know now, because we've had a very good set of reports from the leading scientists of the world, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Their 5th assessment report has made it abundantly clear that climate change is real, it's human-induced, it's already very, very serious, and it could threaten the very existence of human life in the world, because there could be a time where the consequences were such that we could not predict that the world would be livable. That seems to me to be an extraordinarily serious issue for all of us, not just governments, but all of us, families, communities, every sector of society. When I realized how serious the situation was, I got engaged in particular in women's leadership because I was at the conference in Copenhagen and then following that, the conference in Cancun. And I realized that even though the world of negotiation on climate is a very male world still, and I'll come back to that, that in fact there had been 2 women who presided over the conference, the COP, in Copenhagen, Connie Hedegaard from Denmark, in Cancun, Patricia Espinosa, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, and there was about to be a third woman in South Africa, Maite Mashaban. So those three women agreed that they would form a group of women ministers, women leaders, women heads of agencies of the UN, etc. And we encouraged that in Realising Rights, and later the foundation which I established in Dublin, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, became the secretariat of that foundation. And we did have an impact on that very male world because we worked together. Starting in Durban, we decided that we would try to promote a new decision to introduce a whole gender dimension into thinking about climate change. Why was that important? Because if you're undermining poor livelihoods, who is most affected? Who picks up the pieces? It has a different impact on men and women at grassroots level because of their different roles. It's women who still have to put food on the table, who maybe have to go much further for the firewood or the water, who have to worry about the impacts on their health, the impacts on their children, the impacts on their whole way of life, because they can be suddenly finding themselves with their houses destroyed, with their livelihoods gone. And so it was extraordinarily important to get that gender dimension into the climate discussions. And we prepared ourselves during the year after the Durban conference for the conference in Doha, even though it wouldn't be presided over by a woman. It was going to be the male Minister for Environment who would preside in Doha, in Qatar. And we divided up the work among a number of women ministers, and Christiana Figueres, the executive head of the UNFCCC process, advised that she would help with how we would get the decision included. We got Finland to bring it into the European Union context and get all the 28 members of the European Union to agree, and we came to Doha with a draft decision with the support of UN Women of the United Nations, and we were ready to go. And then a lawyer in the European Commission, which was going to propose, the European Union was going to propose this proposal, had looked at the small print and said there was a bit of a problem, because if you table a new decision, which this would be, to have gender balance in all the delegations and in all the institutions of the UNFCCC, and to have gender as an item on the agenda at every meeting, and to have a gender program in the future, which was the idea to bring about gender-sensitive and then gender-responsive climate policy. This lawyer found that if you tabled something, it was almost impossible to have that decided at the same meeting. So Christiana Figueres called me into her office and said, "Mary, we're in trouble." And I said, "What's wrong? I mean, we're ready to go." And no, there's a problem. And I said, "What's the problem?" And she explained. And she said, "So Mary, it's almost impossible." And I said, "Well, define almost." And she said, "Well, if the president of the conference were to take this on board." I said, "Right, we'll work on him. We'll get everybody to work on him." And we had discussions with him during a gender day, and then we got a whole range of different countries to speak on the floor when the item was raised, so that there was an overwhelming feeling that this had to be decided at the COP, and it was decided in Doha at the COP. And it was part of bringing about more of a people-centered approach, because now there is a work program on gender, which wasn't there before, and there is a real sense, and we're working still on this, of getting human rights and climate change and gender equality into the text for the Paris Agreement. But as we've gone further from Doha, and our decision there on gender became known as the Doha Miracle, because we got past the problems. We then came to Warsaw, and we came to Lima in Peru. And I was very conscious that we were heading towards a year of incredible importance, 2015. And I began to think about the fact that sometimes there are particular years that really matter for humanity as a whole, and 2015 is one of those. In fact, the only other one that I can think of that is comparable was 1945. 1945 was after 2 world wars, a Holocaust, the opening up of a Cold War, and this sense of never again. There was a kind of driven sense, we've got to bring this to a halt, we've got to move forward. And the world came together in an extraordinary way. And what happened? We got the Charter of the United Nations. We got a Marshall Plan for Europe that had been devastated by the Second World War on top of the First World War. We got the institutions of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And just a few years later, in 1948, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt played such a role in. And I think to myself, we actually are going to be looking at decisions this year that are of similar importance. We're going to be looking at 3 big agendas that are completely linked. They're actually the one agenda, but it's looking at it from slightly different perspectives. First of all, in July, we'll be talking about financing for development. It's the 3rd World Conference on Financing for Development, and that has to include additional financing because we need much more adaptation to climate change. We need much more transfer of technology to make sure that countries can go carbon neutral as fast as possible in order to stay below the 2 degrees of warming that the world has decided will keep us relatively safe. We'll still have more climate shocks. Each year it will get a little bit worse, but it will be livable and we can cope with it and adapt to it and become resilient. So that's the first one, the Financing for Development Conference in Addis Ababa in July. And then we have an extraordinarily important summit in September in order to replace the Millennium Development Goals, which were extraordinarily important for development in developing countries, but really only applied to developing countries in tackling poverty and children getting education and gender equality and other issues of importance, health Millennium Goals. But the only goal that was relevant to developing countries was the goal on the role in financing the Millennium Development Goals, and unfortunately we haven't fully lived up to the commitments that we should have made of a minimum of 0.7% of GDP of countries. Relatively few countries, most of them European, have reached that target, but we haven't really fully taken our responsibility. The Millennium Development Goals are being replaced by Sustainable Development Goals. And these were worked on by a working group of countries, and they are now in a process of open negotiation between the countries of the United Nations, and they will apply to all countries, including the United States. And they are a commitment that comes from the Rio Conference, the initial Rio Conference in 1992, but then the Rio +20 conference, which decided that no country was actually living in a context of sustainable development. No country had achieved sustainable development. So we really needed to rethink and to have sustainable development goals which would apply to all countries. And indeed, one of those goals, there are 17 goals, and goal 13 is a goal on climate change. So there's a real link with the other big agenda, which is the one that I'm particularly focusing on, an agenda for an agreement, a climate agreement in Paris, which would keep us below 2 degrees of global warming and have a good, fair balance of responsibility between countries. In the convention itself, it's called Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capabilities. It has been a bit of a political divide, but it is understandable that poorer countries and even the large emerging economies like the Chinas and Indias would say, rightly, that the countries of North America and Europe and Korea and other countries developed by using fossil fuel, by using coal, oil and gas, and they polluted during that period in historic pollution and began to create the big problem. Now China is the biggest emitter, but not the biggest emitter by head of population. Just because of its size of population, it's the biggest emitter. But nonetheless, there is that sense of wanting an equitable agreement. And when the Secretary General appointed me as his special envoy on climate change, he particularly wanted me to encourage all countries to be more ambitious, every country, even the smallest countries, to be more ambitious, because at present, as I think many of you here in this university know, but it's not fully appreciated more widely, we are not on course for a safe world. Most scientists now would say we're on course for a 3, maybe 4 degree warming world. The World Bank, a year or two ago, brought out a report called Turn Down the Heat. And it was a report about how they estimated a 4 degree world would look like. And it is very catastrophic. Terrible weather shocks, sea level rises, droughts, precipitation everywhere in a way that is destructive, and a kind of a very grim picture. I think it's important that we don't get fixated on a grimness of that kind and not know what to do. There is so much we can do, and last summer we had a great climate summit that the Secretary General brought together, and just before that climate summit there was a report about a new climate economy that was the work of former President of Mexico, President Calderon, and his commission. And they looked at what are the steps that can be taken and the sectors that we can work on in order to get to a low-carbon, better future. And they looked at cities, and they looked at land, and they looked at energy, access to energy. And they were very positive about the fact that it's in every country's interests to take this positive climate action and to move forward. We need to do it because we don't really have an option. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has said several times, we actually don't have a plan B. We have no choice about this. It's going to be a case of taking the right decision because it's the only decision that will save humanity. The Foreign Minister of France, who will be the president of the conference in Paris in December, Laurent Fabius, says in beautiful French, which I'm not going to imitate, I'll say it in my Irish accent, in English, he says, and he's right, he says, we are the first generation to fully understand the dangers of climate change, and the last generation with time to do something about it. And that really is something that we have to all think about, because we're thinking about our children and our grandchildren and their children. And we have a responsibility, and that's why I equate it with 1945. In 1945, they were thinking of the terrible things that had happened in the past, and they said never again. We have a tougher task. We have to say, if we don't take good decisions this year, terrible things can happen to future generations and to vulnerable countries and communities in current generations, in real time. So that was what brought me to the idea of climate justice. There is a very grim injustice in the impacts of climate change, that they do affect more vulnerable countries and more vulnerable communities in this country and other more developed, resilient parts of the world. And we know that Sandy and Katrina affected communities that took much longer to recover because they were more vulnerable and because they were poorer and didn't have the capacity to adapt well. And that's true all over the world, but it's particularly true of those who are in the front line of being most vulnerable. And I've had occasion to see firsthand 2 examples of that that really affected me, because there's a sadness about the situation that just brings to our mind how important it is that we take the right decisions this year. The first is a friend of mine, Ursula Rickover, started about a year ago to move her people from a small cataract island to Papua New Guinea. There are 1,500 people on her island, and they can no longer live there. So she, as a young leader there, a woman leader, has negotiated land and bought it in Papua New Guinea. She also worked on the relationships, because when you move 1,500 people to a different place, you have to discuss the implications of that. And she worked on that. And then she says, with such sadness, she says, but there's nothing I can do about the fact that we will have to move from the land of the bones of our ancestors. And for an indigenous people, that's of huge sadness, the land of the bones of our ancestors. And there may be quite a number of small island states who will face that quite soon, and big countries like the Philippines and Bangladesh and Vietnam, where millions of people may have to move because of flooding and because of unlivable conditions where they would normally have lived, to be climate-displaced people. I sat last week in Geneva on a panel with the president of a small country that may disappear, President Tong of Kiribati. He has already bought land in Fiji as a kind of insurance policy, so that if it comes to that, he will have to move his people. But what do you do about all that identity, sovereignty of a people? He's a president of a country and comes to the United Nations. If his country goes under and he moves to Fiji, is he still president of a country? Or is he just part of a displaced group of 100,000 people who can no longer live in their home? I mean, these are extraordinary questions for us to be asking. I talk a lot, as somebody who served for 5 years as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mentioned it already, adopted in 1948 under the great leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. And every American can be very proud of the role that she played and the commission that drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But I know that they never envisaged the unimaginable, that human-induced conduct, because that's what it is, was going to bring about the ending of existence of some small countries, some small island states. If we don't stay well below the 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And this is where we come to not just the responsibility of governments, but all of our responsibility. What can we do as individuals, as communities, as families, as universities to change behavior, to say, we can have good lives, but they have to be lives that are more nurturing of our world, that are more sustainable, that can develop cyclical ways in which nothing is wasted, and we use waste to produce energy, and we think innovatively, and we use renewable energy, and we get rid of subsidies on fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and we move to renewable energy. I took part in the wonderful climate march in New York last September. I'm sure a number of you must have got to New York for that. I will never forget it. 400,000 people came out into the street and marched. And I was busy marching. In fact, I was marching with my fellow elder, Gru Brundtland. It was wonderful to be marching with her, the sort of mother of sustainable development. And we had a placard up as we marched along. But I saw another placard that I very nearly wanted to go behind. And it was one which simply said, "Angry Grannies." And I felt, there's something about that. Because, I do think quite a lot. I'm a lucky granny, a lucky Irish granny. I've had 3 children, and I now have 5 grandchildren. I suppose I aspire to 6, but 5 is pretty good. And they're young. They'll be in their 40s in 2050. We know that they will share the world with about 9 billion other people. And I do ask myself, what will they think about us? What will they say about us, about what we did or didn't do in 2015? Did we take the decisions on financing for development, on the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially on a good, fair, binding climate agreement in December in Paris, so that they would have a livable world? They will know that it's a world that will be a little bit worse, or maybe quite a bit worse than the world we're living in now, but not an impossible world? Or will they say, because they might, how could they have been so unthinking, so selfish? How could they not have realized? So I think that this is something that universities have to speak out a lot about, and I'm delighted that you have such strengths and such commitment here in the University of Arizona, because I do happen to know that in a certain important body in this country, there doesn't seem to be the same commitment and conviction about climate change. So you have a task to perform to try to improve that. And I know that there are a number of students who've asked, or are going to ask, some really good questions. And I love the question part of a discussion like this, because I think one voice speaking without relating to the questions that the audience want to hear can go on too long. I remember when I was President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, it was sort of brought home to me by my supportive spouse that I talked about. A supportive spouse is also somebody who tells you what you need to know, not just what you need to hear, not just what you want to hear. And he said to me at one stage, he said, "Mary, you tend to talk for too long." And nobody will tell a president they're talking for too long. So please listen to my cough. And when I was in full flight as president speaking, I would suddenly hear this cough in the audience, and I better wind up now. And it got to the stage where even when he wasn't there, I would hear his cough. And I sort of kind of almost heard it a few minutes ago. So I'm going to end with wonderful words of a good friend, a mentor of mine, somebody who inspired me greatly, and unfortunately died too young. She was a wonderful woman who was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in her native Kenya, in particular, on environment and peace. Wangari Maathai. She was a wonderful personality. I remember her being invited several times to come to the United Nations to make a speech, because everybody wanted to hear her, both before and especially after she got the Nobel Prize. And Wangari would come and she'd be told she had 5 minutes. And forget it. Wangari didn't come to the UN to speak just for 5 minutes. She came to tell her story and tell it with such incredible conviction and impress upon us all the steps that needed to be taken, the trees that needed to be planted, what she was doing in Kenya, how she was standing up to bullies, etc., and that this was necessary to happen. And I just want to end with what I think are very prescient words of hers, very far-seeing. Somehow she understood what 2015 was going to be about, although she died several years ago now. And she said, "In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground." I actually believe that this is where we are now. We have to reach a higher moral ground of human solidarity, where we realize that we only have one planet Earth, one Mother Earth, one world, and it's almost like the Titanic. It's not just those in steerage who will drown. Ultimately, if the world becomes unlivable, everybody is affected. It may come in slightly different stages, but actually it's accelerating even as we speak. So we do need a human solidarity that will ensure that we take the right decisions this year and that we ratchet up the ambition to ensure that we stay below the 2 degrees Celsius, stay on a course for a safe world, and have those children and grandchildren and that 9 billion people say in some way or other, as they, I think, would, thank goodness they did reach that higher level of consciousness, that higher moral ground. So please keep up the good work here in this university. We really need it, and I love being here because of what you stand for. Thank you very much. questions.
We have a few questions for President Robinson submitted by students on climate change and human rights. And so I'd like to invite to the stage America Lutz-Ley, who is a PhD student in arid lands, and she's also a Carson Howery Scholar. She works at the intersection of water and poverty in Sonora. So I'd like to invite America Lutz-Ley to ask some of those questions from the students.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to President Robinson for being with us tonight. Your words actually remind me of this recent fieldwork a couple days ago. We were interviewing high school students about how do they see environmental changes in rural communities of arid Northwest Mexico. And when we asked them, have you ever heard climate change, the concept of climate change? And they were like, yeah, I have heard that in middle school. Okay, what do you think it is? How do you think it will affect you? And they were like, I don't know, I don't remember what the teachers told me. So how can we expect to achieve adaptation if we are failing in climate literacy? I think it's a very, very important work that you do.
Thank you.
Well, we have here 6 questions that were collected by the Institute of the Environment, and I will begin with the first one. Okay? In the United States, there are many marginalized communities that are more susceptible to the effects of climate change, that have little political or financial power, such as poor minority groups that were not able to escape Hurricane Katrina, or Native American populations that lose their crops due to extreme drought. How can those populations and others around the world gain political power to ensure that their needs are accounted for when planning for climate change adaptation?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and it's worth emphasizing, because I've, I suppose, put a lot of emphasis on the impact on developing countries, poor developing countries, small island states. But I also mentioned, and you're reinforcing it, that in this country also, and in Europe, you have communities that are vulnerable, that are living in vulnerable places or are very poor and lack capacity. And the reality is that there isn't enough focus as yet on adaptation. I was very pleased to see that there's a center on adaptation here in the University of Arizona, because we really need to put much more focus on how to support communities to become more resilient, how to listen to their voices, because they often have a lot of wisdom. It's just they don't have the capacity to take the measures that they need to take. And so, I mean, that is a core issue of climate justice. More support for adaptation, more listening to the voices of communities themselves, let them be part of the design of how they become more resilient. And there's actually a very good provision in Goal 13 on climate of the Sustainable Development Goals that I'd recommend students to look at. It's Goal 13B. And it talks about taking measures to ensure that women, youth, and marginalized communities are involved in the design and shaping of how their communities will adapt to climate change. You know, it's quite unusual, and I think we should build on that and try and move forward.
Thank you very much. The second question that we have is, what have been some effective programs that you have seen applied around the world that empower women in ways that make them more resilient to climate change?
I had a good opportunity very recently at the end of February in Chile. I was there for a major women's conference that President Michelle Bachelet and the head of UN Women of the United Nations had called together because we're marking the 20th anniversary of the big Beijing conference, which said that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, and that was a big breakthrough. Well, the day before that high-level conference of women ministers and heads of state and former heads of state, etc., and indigenous women leaders, but it was at a high level, we had an opportunity for a round table of communities in different parts of Chile, and most of those were women who came. There were some men as well, but predominantly women, and it was very good to see the way in which they were being empowered because they just got a little bit of support, very little support, and then they took it on from there. So in one case, there was a training on harvesting rainwater. And once the rainwater was harvested, they could grow crops, they could grow fruit, they got a dryer for the fruit, and it just went on. I mean, in each case, it was quite clear how empowered the women were by a little bit of support. And it's something that we should be aware of, that we can greatly increase local resilience by understanding the need to also focus on women and empowerment. It would help if women had more land rights in a lot of countries and had access to training. Sometimes there's agricultural training and it's the men who get trained, even though women are often the majority of the farmers. There are always these hidden barriers and discriminations that we have to fight against. But there are good examples, yeah.
Thank you. Question number 3 is, economic and conflict migration is a continuing problem in many parts of the world, and now Syrians are fleeing civil war. The global community struggles to deal with economic and conflict migration. How can we possibly address climate migration in the future?
Again, that's a really, really good question. I'm aware that Tucson is relatively near to the border with Mexico and that you have a lot of expertise in this area and a lot of interest. And I do feel that we have to think a lot more about what I call climate-displaced people. I don't call them climate refugees because the word refugees means that there's a convention and refugees are recognized in certain circumstances and have protections under the United Nations. There's nothing for climate-displaced people. There's no provision. And yet, there are hundreds of thousands, there are millions of people who have already been quietly displaced, many of them within their own country, by flooding, by not being able to return to where they were. That terrible hurricane cyclone that hit the Philippines, that had destroyed whole towns and villages and made it impossible for people to return there. They are climate displaced. They are, very poor. But we will see more and more people who have to leave their countries. I mentioned some examples already that this is happening. Leave their countries of origin and move. And I think we have to pay much more attention to this. Some people have done work on principles for climate-displaced people, for internally displaced people, and that's the first beginning of really thinking about it. My foundation has made a commitment. As of next year, we're going to put a particular focus on trying to be a convener and a bridger of the work that's being done on climate-displaced people. I mean, we're quite small. If there's somebody working on that here in Arizona, I think we'd be delighted to work with them because it is a very big and important problem.
Thank you. Next question is from National from Mexico. She asked that in a country such as Mexico, praised for its leadership on climate change and the inclusion of gender, what can we do as individuals and internationally to ensure that these announced policies are put into practice in ways that are meaningful to the poor, women, and marginalized, given rampant corruption, violence, and repression within governing bodies?
Well, that's a big question.
It's a big question. But, it's what Mexicans are asking ourselves right now.
But I have to say, and I say this very genuinely, I just would like to acknowledge the good role that Mexico has played at the international level on climate. First of all, after what was regarded as a pretty sort of, not a complete disaster in Copenhagen, because we got the Copenhagen Accords, but it wasn't a good moment in Copenhagen. We didn't succeed in the way that the world wanted. The government of Mexico, and in particular Patricia Espinosa, as the foreign minister of Mexico, went out of their way to go around the world and to really be involved in climate diplomacy at a very serious level. And that led to the Cancun conference, which put us on the right course for where we are now, going towards Paris. And I mean, it has been acknowledged globally, and I think it deserves to be. Mexico has also contributed to the Green Climate Fund, as a developing country with a lot of other problems to deal with. And there are good examples, as you say, they've taken gender very seriously, which I very much welcome. Of course, there are lots of problems, and it's a large country in those terms to deal with these issues. But at the international level, it is regarded as a very progressive country on climate change. And so I'd just like to acknowledge that. And as I said, I think strengthening women at local level and having more resources for adaptation is a very good way of helping communities that are finding their livelihoods being further undermined by climate shocks. You know, it's a real problem when farmers don't know when to sow, when weather changes come that are unpredictable, when you don't have any insurance, you don't have any plan B in your life, and you can be really affected by climate. So we have to take this very, very seriously and try, as I say, to have more human solidarity, more support, both internationally, nationally, and locally for adaptation. I think that's one of the things that we've learned.
Thank you. The last question that I have in this list is, there have been financial mechanisms set up internationally to help countries to face loss and damages related to climate change. How are these mechanisms taking into account human rights, given that the most marginalized and susceptible people are in some cases the most expensive and hardest to reach?
Yeah, again, it's an interesting question, because we have talked a lot about mitigation, reducing the emissions, getting out of fossil fuel if possible, getting into renewables. We've talked about adaptation, adapting to these climate shocks. But sometimes we're now learning that the climate shocks will be so severe, they go beyond being able to adapt. And that will mean that we will have to have, at the international level, a mechanism for loss and damage. This is now being discussed. It's a hard argument to make at the international level, because unfortunately the rich countries don't want to be paying more, and they feel we're going to have to pay for this. But actually, it's very much about the impact that climate is having very severely on some communities, and it's gone beyond just adaptation. And so countries both nationally, but also the question mentioned an international mechanism. We will have to have an international mechanism on loss and damage, and we will have to pay more and more on loss and damage unless we mitigate more. And this is a real question. If we mitigate more, then we won't have to, the effects will be less severe. Again, I come back to that report of the World Bank, Turn Down the Heat. It's worth reading. It's very frightening, because it's saying that if we don't stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming, then very quickly all kinds of maybe irreversible impacts, the Arctic, permafrost, rising seawater drowning big cities, including cities in the United States, very large parts of them. This is all within the lifetime of children being born today. And loss and damage is a sort of scale. If we do more mitigation, we don't have to do as much adaptation. If we don't do mitigation and we don't do proper adaptation, we'll have more loss and damage. I think it's right to point out that this is becoming a reality, but we should be doing more to prevent it from being the reality for people.
Thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thank you. I'd just like to actually say they were really good questions. I had a very quick sight of them. I felt like a student who'd been shown the exam papers, but I wasn't shown them long enough to, be able to think what might be the best answers. But the questions, almost all of them, they were very people-centered, and they raised these issues of human rights and gender. So maybe my last point is a lot of the focus of the work of my foundation at the moment is to ensure that there will be language in the text for Paris, for the Paris Agreement, about the need for all climate action to respect all human rights, or maybe even stronger, respect, protect and fulfill all human rights, which is what the mandate holders of the Human Rights Council have asked for, and that there be gender equality in the climate agreement. Interestingly, there is a goal on gender equality, Goal 5, in the Sustainable Development Goals. It's much more secure because in a development context, gender equality seems much more obvious. But because environment and science were the source of the UNFCCC, it's a world that isn't as gender sensitive despite the work that we did in Doha. So we had to work even harder to get the draft text in, which we now did in Geneva. So there is text there on human rights and gender, but I'm not sure if it will stay during these negotiations. And I'm, really of the view that, again, universities should be a voice for these issues, because this isn't just language. This is about what we've been talking about. It's about making climate change more people-centered and being willing to talk about and think about climate justice and what is a fairer world for everyone. I've really been delighted to take part in the discussions here in the University of Arizona, and I hope to retain a link because it's heartening, to be honest. It's really encouraging here in Arizona to get a sense that people understand that we are talking about the need for human solidarity, the need for a greater sense of our common humanity, the need for something that was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although it didn't deal with climate, and that is that we are equal in dignity and rights. And there's a lot about human dignity. It was the way in which the Secretary General brought out his synthesis report. He framed it around human dignity. And I think human dignity and climate justice are vital for the next few years. And 2015 is such an important year. Thank you very much.